Media moguls don't tend to be as well known as A-list celebrities and world leaders, but then again, Rupert Murdoch isn't your average billionaire news broadcasting tycoon. They call him the modern-day Citizen Kane, because his rise from small-time local newspaper to multinational conglomerate CEO has all the twists and turns of a classic rags to riches story. Kind of. Even his private life feels like an episode of Succession, with sibling rivalries, high-profile divorces, and the occasional television appearances. But Rupert Murdoch is a whole different beast to Orson Welles' character in the classic Hollywood tale of the newspaper industry. Murdoch's influence on the size, shape, and nature of media is as widespread as it is devastating. Some good, some bad, some ugly. Given that the Australian-born media maverick is close to a century old, it seems fair to say that his time at the top is coming to an end. But will his influence survive the rise of social media and alternative journalism, or is his legacy as dead as legacy media? Well, it's time to learn how history works as we examine the life of Rupert Murdoch. This week's video is sponsored by Ground News. One of the key themes you'll see throughout this video is that Murdoch became a media giant through sensationalism. While it's good for business, it's awful for an informed public. Fortunately, Ground News is the perfect solution for this. For example, the story about how Lachlan Murdoch, Rupert's heir, would be taking over Fox Corporation had left-oriented biased reports about Rupert still exerting his power, and right-leaning takes about how he was passing down a legacy to be proud of. With features that show factuality, coverage details, and bias distribution, you'll know beforehand the level of trust you can have in what you're reading. Before you read any article, you should always have the question answered, what's this author's bias, so that you have the appropriate level of suspicion when you're reading something. Ground News makes reading the news easier and more enjoyable, and you can become smarter knowing that you don't have to surf for both sides yourself. Let Ground News do the heavy lifting for you. Develop a well-rounded worldview, and check out ground.news/howhistory to sign up for less than $1 a month, or get 40% off unlimited access to the Vantage plan. Born on March 11th, way back in 1931, he was named Keith, but since a young age, he went by the middle name he received from his maternal grandfather, Rupert. He was raised on a small ranch named Cruden Farm in the south of Melbourne, Australia. But this wasn't some humble John Steinbeck-esque situation. The stone building was adorned with colonial pillars, and the insides were furnished with fine painting, a library, plus grand piano. Here, young Rupert, spent his time riding horses through expansive green farmland. But his mother denies his early years were overindulgent. It was a very normal childhood. I suppose he was lucky to be brought up in attractive surroundings. His parents were both native Australians who had lived in Scotland, specifically Cruden Bay, where their farm got its namesake. Though young Murdoch would not return to his Scottish roots, he did follow in his father's footsteps, who was, at the time, a well-known journalist. In fact, Sir Keith Murdoch Sr. owned a number of local and regional newspapers, such as the Herald in Melbourne and Brisbane's own Courier Mail, plus Sunday Mail, and the simply named News. That's not a bad portfolio for a man whose early career was hindered by a stutter. However, he did receive some recognition during the early struggles of his press career. During his time in World War I, his reporting on the mismanagement of the Gallipoli campaign and the hardships of the troops got noticed. This helped to shake up the military leadership. No doubt, this proved to his son the power of the newspaper. Of his childhood, Rupert Murdoch remarked, "I was brought up in a publishing home, a newspaper man's home. I saw that life at close range, and never really considered any other." From an early age, he was groomed to work in printing, which put him on track for an esteemed education. He graduated from a prestigious Australian boarding school called Geelong Grammar, before moving to London in 1949 to study philosophy, politics, and economics at Oxford University. Apparently, he was a typical student. He drank too much, chased girls, gambled, and even had a bust of Lenin in his dorm. He was so involved with left-wing activism that he participated in various Labour Party organizations, which earned him the nickname Red Rupert. But a few years later, Keith Sr. suddenly died from cancer, leaving a 22-year-old Rupert Murdoch to become owner of a crumbling media empire. Following a quick apprenticeship at the Daily Express, Murdoch returned down under to revive his late father's business. And revive them he did. He learned fast. He immersed himself in all aspects of the daily operations, like writing headlines, designing page layouts, and even laboring in the printing rooms. However, it was his business savvy that rejuvenated the ailing companies. When his father had died, the death duties had eaten up most of the stock he held, leaving Rupert and his family with little to play with. What they did have were some failing newspapers in Adelaide and a remote station in Broken Hill. But by controversially pivoting towards crime, sex, and scandal, circulation soared. He was starting to make a name for himself, so had to keep on his toes. A rival daily newspaper tried to buy his papers from him quietly, but once Murdoch caught wind of their scheme, he ran a front page denouncing the move along with an editorial about the evils of press monopoly. He caught a taste of being sued too. One time, an Aborigine was accused of murder, but many felt the evidence was dubious, including Murdoch, so his papers came to the defense. This action was unpopular, and his small company was dragged through the courts on charges of libel. In the end, they were acquitted. Not to be hindered, Murdoch spent this next stretch of his career expanding at an impressive rate. By 1956, Murdoch had bought out Perth's Sunday Times, which too was revamped to fit with his commercially successful sensationalism. By 1960, Murdoch had broken into Sydney's market with his purchase of Mirror. He transformed the struggling paper into the city's bestseller. By 1965, Murdoch had set his sights on founding a brand new paper. He was done with buying failing businesses, and instead wanted to make something a success from day one. Australia's first national daily paper was created that same year and aptly named The Australian. No small feat given the wide expanses of land between the coasts. But having all those printing presses dotted around the country made getting the news through the outback much more possible. But Rupert wasn't going to stay in the land of kangaroos forever. In fact, he'd eventually relinquish his Australian citizenship to become a citizen of the US of A, thereby enjoying all the rights and tax breaks of very hardworking billionaires. By 1968, he was 37 years old, with an empire valued at around $50 million, so it was time to make moves in London. Once again, he used his tried and tested tool for success, buying a failing paper, inject some sensationalism, and hey, presto, a money-making machine. For those in the UK, it might be hard to imagine a time when The Sun was just a struggling daily tabloid. For the younger generation, you might not be familiar with The Sun's inclusion of naked women, another controversial tactic that boosted sales. There was one other tabloid that Murdoch bought out, the News of the World. At the time, it was an enormously popular Sunday edition. With a firm hold in London's Fleet Street, Murdoch recalibrated his sights on a new target, a bigger one with more risk and ambition, one that spoke to his long-held love for gambling, America. 1973 was the year he touched down in the US. He acquired Texas-based tabloid The San Antonio News. The year after, he founded a brand new tabloid called The Star before heading to New York 2 years later to buy The Post. With a strong presence in 3 major English-speaking countries, 1979 became the year to consolidate. The name for his holding company was News Corporation, more simply known as News Corp. Though Murdoch continued to add news outlets to his portfolio throughout the 80s and 90s, such as the Chicago Sun-Times, Village Voice, and New York Magazine, his primary focus on print news was coming to an end. That's because the medium of television had developed enough to become the new battleground for news. A quick pause before we get into Fox News and the impact of the 24-hour news cycle as we indulge in the spirit of the Murdoch media machine by investigating his own private life. Let's quickly go over his 4 ex-wives and 6 children. The first Mrs. Murdoch was Patricia Booker, a former flight attendant from Melbourne. Married in 1956, divorced in 1967, with their only child Prudence entering the news publishing dynasty in 1958. Prudence has held several directorial roles in News Corp, but apparently is the only one of his children not directly competing for his business affections. Ex-wife number 2 was Anna Maria de Peyster, a Scottish and Australian journalist who scooped $1.7 billion in the divorce. Her marriage to Murdoch lasted from 1967 until 1999 and produced 3 heirs, Elizabeth, Lachlan, and James, all of whom are executives of sorts. Less than 3 weeks after officially breaking things off with Anna, Murdoch married Wendy Deng, a media executive almost 37 years his junior. She birthed 2 more daughters for Rupert, Grace and her younger sister Chloe. In fact, Grace Murdoch's godfather is Tony Blair. But more on that later. The couple called it quits in 2013, but by 2016, Murdoch had found another wife, Jerry Hall. The former model and actress is still much younger than Murdoch, although he's only a bit older than her former partner Mick Jagger. Their marriage ended in 2022, yet Murdoch seemed like he hadn't given up on love. 1 year later, he proposed to his partner Anne Leslie Smith. However, the engagement was called off, apparently due to her infatuation with Tucker Carlson. Speaking of Fox News hosts, Murdoch is arguably most well known for setting up the 24-hour right-wing leaning channel. He wasn't jumping in the deep end though. He had been dipping his toes in the news media landscape by purchasing independent TV stations as well as 20th Century Fox Film Corp. His printing business also moved laterally by consolidating his academic and literary business into HarperCollins. Like any billionaire worth his salt, Murdoch bought and sold sports teams like the LA Dodgers and even had stakes in the LA Kings, the New York Rangers, plus the Lakers, the Knicks, and even Madison Square Garden. That means his newspapers printed scandals on the players of his teams who played in his arenas that were filmed by his television cameras to capture the moments that would be dramatized in movies, which could be adapted into novels that were reviewed in his newspapers. Whew. No doubt that Lennon bust from his student days would be proud to see him buying up the means of production. Speaking of production, Fox News was a game changer. Granted, CNN was the first network to do round-the-clock news coverage, but it's fair to say that it was Murdoch who took it to the next level. CNN's political influencing was small-time in comparison, though nonetheless damaging, according to the likes of Noam Chomsky. However, Fox News' approach was bombastic and in-your-face. He injected sensationalism into 24/7 news coverage, proving that the business model was viable. Cable news became a fiercely competitive landscape, and Fox News never shied from gloating about its success. It's been argued by many social scientists that the station's political discourse has a profound influence on election cycles. After all, it was the 1997 endorsement of Tony Blair by Murdoch's UK's papers that got the Labour Party into favor for the first time in 18 years. This begs the question, is Rupert Murdoch right-wing or left-wing? Fox News may be pro-Trump, but Rupert Murdoch is infamously opposed to the Orange Man in the White House. In fact, Fox News became too successful for Murdoch's own good. Take Tucker Carlson, the conservative commentator whose show was a ratings killer. That was until the once famed bow tie wearer was unceremoniously booted from the network. Rumors abounded over the cause. Carlson was getting too religious on the show. Murdoch's wife had a crush on him. Powerful shareholders were worried about the influence Carlson had on the direction of the network. Some say an impending scandal needed to be covered up to protect the network. No one knows for sure, but whatever the reason, getting rid of him proved Murdoch was losing his edge. Media commentators theorized that Fox believed it was the time slot that was the main attraction, not the guy behind the desk. Yet Tucker Carlson's first episode on his Twitter show torpedoed that logic with astronomical viewership. The real irony is that the platform he used, Twitter, is built on Murdoch's successful model for 24-hour news cycles. No doubt, legacy media is struggling to compete with the likes of internet shows. Even Joe Rogan has more listeners than Murdoch's radios combined, and with a smaller infrastructure. Murdoch's behemoth of an empire can't compete with the nimbleness of YouTube channels. Gatekeepers to publication have lost their power in a world of Substack. With so many cogs in Murdoch's machine, it's not a surprise that something would go wrong. Sooner or later, someone would live the life and shine a light on the news stories hiding within. The News of the World phone hacking scandal may have been a bigger deal in Europe, but the impact on Murdoch's reputation and empire has global ramifications. Though proof of phone hacking of celebrities and police had emerged between 2005 to 2006, it wasn't until 2011 that the story erupted. Through a high-profile court case, it was alleged that the News of the World, under direct orders, had tapped into people's phones for the purposes of illegally gathering scoops. Typical victims were celebrities, but the most egregious incident involved a murdered schoolgirl. It was claimed that journalists hacked the phones of Amanda Miley Dowler during her disappearance. It was alleged that they deleted voicemails to free up space so they could be the first to print updates on the case. However, by doing this, they falsely gave hope to Miley's family that she was still alive, whilst potentially impeding the police investigation that resulted in the apprehension of a serial killer. That was denied, of course, by the paper's editor, Piers Morgan. Not that it helped. Several News of the World employees were arrested and convicted. Executives were brought before Parliament to be grilled in an inquiry. Eventually, the public outrage forced Murdoch to shut down the newspaper. Murdoch was also criticized for staging a clearly rehearsed, PR-friendly opening speech when it was his time to speak in front of the television cameras. His attempt to garner sympathy fell short when he was custard-pied, leaving rival newspapers to relish in the moment with headlines like "Murdoch eats humble pie." In UK history, this scandal is one of the defining moments that has led to increased skepticism and distrust of the press. No doubt you can think of moments that were equivalent in the US. But this story wouldn't be a modern-day Citizen Kane if there wasn't hubris.
Something. And this is not as an excuse, maybe it's an explanation of my laxity. The News of the World is less than 1% of our company. I employ 53,000 people around the world. And I'm spread watching and appointing people whom I trust to run those divisions.
Murdoch started off as a plucky, left-leaning reporter who wanted to follow in his father's footsteps by exposing corruption and sticking up for the little guy. Now, he's the poster child for monopoly, propaganda, and political meddling. it seems the right time for him to retire, though perhaps the infighting amongst his children for the right to inherit the reins of News Corp have been for nothing. Murdoch is too out of touch to keep up with alternative media, and the structure of legacy media is crumbling under its own weight. It could be that Murdoch's vast empire, built up over decades, is simply yesterday's news. Perhaps it's time for Murdoch to sell up some plucky press magnate, or maybe he has one more trick up his sleeve to get back on his feet. But what do you think? Let us know in the comments below. Much of the reason why Murdoch focused on sensationalism was that in order to get advertising dollars, he needed to get views. To understand why the history of advertising has such a tight relationship with journalism, watch our video on the history of advertising. And don't forget to like and subscribe to keep on learning how history works.